Welcome to the Neophytes of Narratology, the internet's most pretentious and pseudo-intellectual pursuit since, perhaps, Nietzsche's thus podcast Zarathustra, or Camus' renowned Vlog of Sisyphus. While lesser men aspire to stand on the shoulders of mere giants, we at the Lost Signals will accept nothing less than titans. So join us as we delve into the fundamentals of narrative nuance and critique the critics who proclaim to know the universal qualities of effective storytelling. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Neophytes of Unreliable Narratology. I'm Jonathan Ian Manzer, who always has his facts straight, but may misrepresent them. Here with Scott Thurla.
Or am I?
Steve Formosi.
And I never have my facts straight.
And Christopher Morgan.
Yep.
So, last time on Neophytes of Narratology, we took a look at Hulk Hogan, Gawker, and the idea of personal narrative and where fact and fiction lies therein.
Mm-hmm.
Today we are going more into the actual mechanics behind narrative, specifically the unreliable narrator, as you might have gathered. We're using, as a framework, a work by a woman named Dan Shin, who, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, I apologize, who basically had an overview of how different theorists had viewed the unreliable narrator.
Applied different
time.
techniques and so forth. Yeah.
But unlike other shows we might have done where we would have gone point for what she said, we're more going to just use this as a framework for a discussion on what the unreliable narrator is and what we personally think are the effective use of that. And maybe give some common examples on it.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yep.
One of the really interesting points, and oddly enough, when you're studying things academically, sometimes people make points that seem obvious once you hear them, but you never had thought about prior to hearing it.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
One of the points she brings up is that there's kind of a spectrum, and kind of multiple spectrums running in the use of unreliable narrators, particularly whether, in a sense, is the narrator lying to you maliciously or with intent of lying, or is it, in a sense, just
Lack
the
of knowledge.
fool? Or there's all different aspects of that. So I wanted to gather some of your guys' thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting to talk about because there's obviously the narrator who specifically tries to get you to believe something that is wrong or misleads you in some way, and then there's the narrator who just doesn't have the information. And I think there was another thing that was kind of cool that was talked about in this paper, which was again that narrator who's wrong, or it's more talking about the narration, right, than the specific narrator themselves. So there's two ways of misleading an audience: either you give them wrong information, or you give them insufficient information in order to get the story. So, well, I mean, you see a lot of that in where you're not following a specific character, and there's things that are happening off book or off screen or whatever that you're not privy to, and you kind of find them out later. A lot of detective stories and stuff like that work this way.
Yeah, I was just about to ask about the noir aspect, where they're narrating the story as they go, but obviously they're withholding a certain amount of information.
Well, that's interesting because there's, in a sense, two levels of unreliability there. And as I said, there's a lot of spectrum, or a lot of different axes.
A lot of ins, a lot of outs to unreliability.
Which, it's the relationship of the author to his audience as well. Is the author, they actually bring up, interestingly, the incompetent author who fails to give you the necessary information, not the
the fool as the author.
Yeah.
Right.
Who, I forgot to tell you this part of the story, and then like had to go back.
Well, there's also the interesting distinction between the author and the narrator.
Yeah.
Right. The author is the person writing the book. The
which he goes
narrator is
into.
a kind of a character in the book.
That's why I was trying to start off with the narrator individually first, and then jump up to the relationship between the author and the audience. But so, like, I can't help but think of Dostoevsky's The Idiot. If any of you are given that, where that's a great example of a person who is misinterpreting the facts that you're privy to, and it's actually I don't know if it's the most difficult one to do, because it's easier to have
outright, like, untrustworthy-ish.
Yeah.
Like intentionally misleading you.
Because in a way, and I guess it all does tie in with the author, is that if you have a fool, and the fool can be I'll give another example, the Tick, currently. You're privy to the same facts the Tick is in the thing, except that he obviously misinterprets it for humorous effect, but he's endearing for that quality. But you can also be laughing at a person for who's the butt of a joke for not realizing things are going on. So there's so many different ways, and that's why you're given author after author who's like, no, there are 8 different ways to interpret it. No, there are 5.
X and Y did it such and such way, and so many little subdivisions and so forth. Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of it is like that. I mean, they're all interesting stuff, but because of that very fact, she sort of has to go through and then consider it in this light, and then there's this sort of like school of thought.
Well, she does say at some point that she says there's 6 types of unreliability that fall into 2 larger categories. And basically they just turn on these 3 things, which are reporting, interpreting, and evaluating. So there's misreporting, misinterpreting, misevaluating, and then there's underreporting, underinterpreting, and underevaluating.
But that goes, I think, into 2 dynamics there, and that's one school of thought that's, as I mentioned, there's different schools there, is that one is the purposeful, there's a deception there.
Right.
There's a character not telling you enough information, the author not telling you enough information, and obviously that's necessary for some authors to not give you everything in order to make an engaging story. But I think it's more, like, personally, I think it's more interesting the person who you get to see information, this is actually, if you ever deal with books that deal with a large range of cast, Game of Thrones is a great example. As a viewer, you're privy to more information than anyone in that world. Any
single character,
So there's no deception there, but it's just that they're misrepresenting facts that you have.
Or underreporting.
And so I think that you could either view almost every character as unreliable in a sense.
To a certain extent.
Or that it has a very narrow stream, depending on how you want to look at it.
Right. No, I mean, that's a pretty good point. I like it. I like the analogy there, because it serves the example very well, because, you can think of it that way. And in fact, as we mentioned, this essay points out various ways of doing that. But in general, I'm going to wait to get my, I guess, personal favorite use and example of unreliable narration in a story later on. But just having brought that up, I think you're right. It's a lot of interesting stuff to be found there and to be said about that sort of use of it and how it applies.
Yeah. I agree. It's kind of, it's tough to kind of nail down, and a lot of these things cross over. Like a lot of these things that we're talking about cross over.
Yeah, for sure.
Actually,
exactly.
A really important part of this is if you have one type of misrepresentation or whatever, you'll get the specific misrepresentation, then perhaps leaving things out accidentally
unintentional,
as well, unintentional stuff. So all that crossover, a lot of time, it can make for a lot of different ways of doing this, which I think is used to good effect. It's funny you say, it's funny you mentioned Game of Thrones, actually, Ian, because that is, I wouldn't call that unreliable narrator, because none of those characters are actually the narrator, right? I think the closest thing.
Well, in the novels, they are. There's multiple. Actually, there's several.
But they're not narrator. It's following them. They're the protagonist. They're not the narrator.
I see what you mean. Sure. Technically, literally.
George R. R. Martin's God's Eye is the narrator, really. But I think that they just kind of came close to somebody who actually sees everything. With spoilers for Game of Thrones, don't listen. But with Bran, kind of becoming a three-eyed raven is a really interesting way to like take all those stories and be able to like have a character be able to see them all.
It really ties all the stories together, man.
Yeah.
But sure.
But and like that doesn't necessarily tie into being a narrator, but he kind of gets as close as you can to like the God's eye that everybody's that we as readers or viewers see that
have access to. Yeah.
I was going to say Deadpool. Like, because Deadpool, like, at least through the movie, narrates exactly what's going on.
Yeah.
But there's also the fourth wall breaking. There's certain pieces of information that he isn't privy to, that he shouldn't be privy to. It's kind of like this mishmash nether region.
Well, they actually bring up a character type like that, which is the madman knave type of, I guess, archetype of someone who can, break the traditional narrative role because we allow him because he's outside
because of the nature
of our traditional expectations. But I don't also subscribe that first person narration is the only type. If you like follow stories and you're in the head of a character, I think like depending on I guess
like a biopic where basically you're telling the story of a person, but you're extrapolating a lot of stuff that you would not have been privy to were you in and even if you're basing a scene on like a diary or something, that's still the perspective you're still writing a script or a scene based on the bias of whatever material first hand account that goes. So while it may not be a direct narration, a first person narration, the characters themselves, the dialogue, the scene dictates, whether it's reliable or not.
Well, I'll just make it real quick. I know you want to go, but she does focus on biography and autobiography, which I think sort of falls into what you were just saying as a separate section. So there is like, they do address that, but I think you want to say something, Zilo.
Yeah, I was going to respond to what Ian said. I'm not saying that first person narration is the only way to have a narrator, but in the sense of Game of Thrones, the narrator is just kind of, there is no specific character who's narrator. It's just kind of the lens that you're seeing the world through. Like, it's basically George R. R. Martin's God that you can view the entire world.
I disagree.
Somehow.
I think it's more of each chapter represents the different point of view of the character that's being followed, and each of them
has less knowledge than you as a reader.
Like, Jon Snow probably has as much facts as one can get, and Ned Stark as well, have as much fact as one can get in that world, except that they misinterpreted it and it led to like their issues happening.
Stuff.
Sure, I agree with that, but they're not the one who's telling you the story. Yeah. Whereas in like Deadpool is the one who's telling you his story, right?
I get what you mean.
In Game of Thrones, the entity that's telling you the story is
an all-seeing third person, like essentially.
Yeah. You get a top-down view of the entire world, kind of, and you certainly are not privy to every single fact in the world, and that's where some of the surprises come. Obviously, if anybody's familiar with Game of Thrones, they know that there are plenty of those. But it's not because Jon Snow kept something from you that you didn't realize what was going to happen at the end of the first book or at the end of the first season.
Deception doesn't necessarily have to be a part. It could be someone, in a sense, even in their own heads, when you're listening to their inner monologues of the judgment calls they make, being you're given that very much like the fool aspects is as an audience you're given more information than the main character is.
Yeah,
so you get, and that's one of the points that they bring up, which is the role of the relationship between the author and the audience, is that the author has to really do this balance between with the fool, it actually brings the audience and the author closer together as they have this kind of in-joke
crossing over of covenant mentalities.
We're going to enjoy or feel tragedy for a character because we're privy to more knowledge than they are, and we know what's about to befall them, even though they don't. So, like, the other one, I forget. Do you guys remember? There's one where you're drawn closer to the character, but away from the author.
Yes, but I can't remember the specific, like, what it's called or whatever. It's just like a different use of it. Sort of like not the opposite of what you said, but like a different angle of utilizing that effect, but to have a different result, essentially.
I think that was the Youre Kobe thing, right? Hold on one second. Oh no, never mind. That's not what it was.
Actually, speaking of Youre Kobe,
I remember. Yeah, I remember when you were.
The reason I don't want to really go into like Youre Kobe said this, and this is because I actually want to use this work as a springboard for probably conversations later down the line. Actually, Youre Kobe is the one I kind of want to get it references a very influential work that Youre Kobe did. So I would like for us to read that eventually.
I'd like to check out Phelan too. Yeah. Like Phelan is used quite a bit especially in the early parts of this.
Sure. Well, I want to address again. I found myself splitting hairs, sort of being the middleman between you guys. I think it's a very interesting thing you just brought up in terms of like who is the narrator and therefore how much unreliability or reliability there is. That I think it's a great discussion we could have. But I want to. I guess I'll do it here. My personal favorite example, as I alluded to earlier, is The Cask of Amontillado by Edgar Allan Poe. I love that story when I first read it, like a kid, maybe like teenager years, and at its face value, I was like, it's awesome, it's badass. And then I learned about the device of unreliable narration, and then it totally changed my view. Like, once we were taught that, I think they actually used that story as like the early example to show us how you can get that effect out of it, and it changed my interpretation, like how I viewed stories going forward, and of course, narration or narrators, especially when it was in first person. Yeah, I no longer could take things at face value.
I did find what you were talking about, Ian. I completely agree with that, Scott. Yeah, like that is a really... When you first figure out what an unreliable narrator is, like it's at least for us who really like to read and like really enjoy literature and stuff like that, I remember figuring that out and being like, oh, the narrator doesn't always have to be telling the truth and things like that, and that was exactly blew my mind. But I found what you were talking about, Ian. There's a distinction between estranging unreliability and bonding unreliability.
Yeah, I have a little note about that.
In order to account in a more comprehensive and balanced way for the effects of the technique on the audience's intellectual, affective, and ethical relationship to the narrator. So I had that down as a note.
So I have one last point I want to make on this, which goes into how much the author has to cede control to the audience in order to make for the audience to discover it's meant to be an unreliable narrator.
Have like an aha moment, or
so they bring an example of contextual aspects where if you like. They actually bring up Lolita.
I wanted to read a quote about Lolita.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I'll let you do it.
Which is the idea is that like Lolita, the strength of Lolita relies upon the cultural norms, view of like relationships between the older and younger, and that it won't have like if your culture accepts that kind of thing, it won't have as strong of an impact. And also the fact that like judging in a sense the cognitive abilities of your audience. If an audience doesn't recognize that the narrator is unreliable, then
the effect is lost.
Exactly. And the point of the story.
And other things are lost as well.
Well, also it's very dependent on the writing abilities of the author.
Absolutely.
Sure. And
you need to make it clear that your author that your narrator is unreliable to your audience. Yeah. If they can't get that out of your writing, then it needs to be written better.
Otherwise, it just doesn't make sense as a whole. Sure.
But in the sense, that's also like the failing of sarcasm and humor in a sense that if you don't get that, I think it's the same mechanics almost to
I think they're related for sure, I would say. I agree.
A sarcasm to an unreliable narrator because it's using kind of a implied negation there. And so, I don't know. I recommend this, unless you guys have...
I was just gonna. I remembered a book when you guys were talking about it. It's called Blackburn. It was written in the mid to late 90s by Bradley Denton. It's like a first-person account of this guy who's a serial killer, and he's telling you that he's like killed 12 people. So it's just like you go in there like waiting for his victims, and it turns out like, well, I didn't stop this person, and this person killed, therefore his victim is also my victim. So the narration was really, I mean, here you have a first person who subverts your expectation, who's, unreliable, but it's only because you're waiting to see what his interpretation is. It's a great book, and that something one of you guys said just reminded me of that, so I wanted to bring it up.
Well, good reminder as well. I don't have much more to add, but since you brought that up, Chris, I will have to say that my most recent-ish favorite use of unreliable narrator is probably House of Leaves. So if anyone out there has not checked it out, do. If it's intense, don't get me wrong, but it's probably one of the awesomest things that I've read in the past 10 years that use that to an awesome effect, I think. So that's my recommendation for well done use of unreliable narration in a literary work.
Yeah, it is pretty great. House of Leaves is a great book. You'll see an unreliable narrator crops up in a ton of stuff to some extent, and to a small extent in some things, and then to a much larger extent
absolutely.
in others. You'll see it once you know what it is. You'll see it in.
It's like pornography.
Yeah, you'll see it everywhere.
You'll know it when you see it.
And you'll start assessing unreliable narrators where they don't actually exist.
Yeah, you'll start seeing them. You'll become an unreliable paranoid narrator yourself, like I have.
So I'm going to wrap this up quickly, except for I have a point to make afterwards, which could be a can of worms.
Okay.
All right.
Great.
Which, check out, if you're interested in the concept of unreliable narrators, the article we have, we're going to link it to our
It'll be on the site.
Is a great starting point for diving into all these different authors who've worked on like the theory behind unreliable narrators. So I want to bring this though to a contemporary use outside of fiction, and especially to the way they divide up how people like the types of unreliable narrators that are there, and whether people can actually assess it correctly. I'm going to bring up the news for a second. Okay? So we are mentioned that there's basically the two types of unreliable narrators, where you have those who are accurately deceiving you and those who are, in a sense, maybe not misinterpreting events, but providing their bias to it, which might not reflect reality or particularly your reality. Mm-hmm. So I feel that when I read this, I couldn't help but start to comb over this in my mind, is that perhaps a lot of people are like screaming like this term called fake news nowadays. And they're saying that like it's a malicious intent to deceive. Where perhaps, yes, there are perhaps some on both.
Certainly that is probably the case.
There's lies.
Varies.
But perhaps one should take a look at whether people are, in a sense, being unreliable narrators because they're interpreting it through their own bias. And they're not, in a sense, necessarily in the intent to deceive. And I think that a lot of people reflexively look towards the deception.
Like a reactionary to it. Yeah, I see what you mean. Certainly that could be its own episode, perhaps, but it's an interesting point to bring up. And it's funny that you mentioned it because I didn't think about it at all, at least that aspect, while reading this. But I certainly see how it could be applied and could be interesting and perhaps very enlightening if we do apply it.
That's a can of worms. I really have a lot to say on it, but
think about it yourself.
I would definitely say it for another episode because there's absolutely a lot to say on the subject. I've had this conversation with obviously you guys, with my wife, various other people, and that is a great topic. But I think it deserves its own attention.
All right.
What I will say, I'm going to just briefly give my thing and try not to.
I jump into
this rabbit hole too far.
This is what he does.
But
Steve-O is this ultra right wing guy. So,
Alex Jones.
Yeah, thanks, Obama. Do you think like how much? I think an important factor when you're thinking about this at home is how much does it matter to you if you're getting bad information from the news on either side, because it happens on both sides, that whether they're actively trying to deceive you or whether they're negligently deceiving you. What is the, negligently meaning because they are telling a story based on their own bias and they're giving you facts that either don't tell the whole story or facts that are just wrong that maybe they were passed by someone else and didn't do the legwork on them. What is the difference? And I'm not saying that there's no difference. There is. but like how big of a difference does that make to you specifically? And should they be treated as different things? When you say, all right, well, I got bad facts from two sources. One was actively trying to give me bad facts, and the other just gave me bad facts because they didn't do the legwork on their story.
Steve-O is also an anti-vaxxer.
Yeah.
That's correct.
True news.
And he's afraid of vapor trails, too.
But,
contrails, thank you.
As my quick discussion, and I'm so happy I dropped this grenade. I'm more interested in... I'm going to take an economic topic here. A very, very simple one. Basically. So, trickle-down economics, as you know. There's also the idea of like trickle-up economics. Or austerity is a good economic measure. Austerity is a bad economic measure. There are people who legitimately believe both of those. And there are people who have facts to back up their points of view. The problem is when you hear... I feel that people are having an issue delineating in their own mind the difference between an opposing point of view that's rational, an opposing point of view that is mistaken and simply a lie they're told. Mm-hmm. And I feel that I'm not trying to be political in any sense here, one side or the other. I feel it happens on both sides. That as it polarizes, people are going more and more to the extreme reactionary aspect of this is a lie, it's deception, not a different point of view. And I think that we're all now assuming we're unreliable narrators, and we're all assuming that every source of media is either 100% reliable or 100%.
Sure. I see what you mean. Yeah,
but, I mean, I think having that for a lot of us is healthy because that gives us to check different sources. Go to the AP.
But a lot of people don't check different sources.
Yeah, but that's the problem. But that's the problem. Yeah, that's
as we can agree, it's a big problem.
So on the one hand, the positive aspect of it is people like us always check our sources, look at different things, try to take that into account. And other people do proud Democrat and all that stuff. And no matter how many times you tell your family member it's not real, it's propaganda. Just because you agree with it doesn't not make it propaganda.
Sure. Well, now we have the shrapnel of shows.
See, aren't you glad you dropped this grenade?
So good.
Because that could be a 3-part story. And that's not even getting to anti-vaxxers.
So I just want
nobody wants to hear that shit.
One last thought to the audience tonight that you're right to be skeptical of the narration that you hear, but also remember that there are nuances, and even experts don't agree on what the nuances actually are. But it's not just reliable and unreliable. There's shades of gray in between.
Absolutely. So, we can agree upon that.
Yeah. So everyone is lying to you, and they're not lying to you at the same time.
Yep. Schrodinger's lie.
So, any last thoughts?
Well, I was going to sign off with, So we hope to convey the fact that, or at least the idea that here at the Lost Singles on Neophytes of Narratology, we're never intentionally fucking you over, but merely accidentally, of course.
Yeah.
And we're going to be doing a third one, I think, in November on...
part 3 is coming
narrative.
A little bit later.
And maybe as we progress in the year.
Other parts are coming.
More unreliable.
This thing's branching off.
We're only getting more unreliable, of course. As
I'll drop more grenades as we go along.
Very nice.
I'm Jonathan Neomancer, and I'm here to drop grenades here with Scott Thurlow.
And I'm here to drop just literary bombs.
Stephen Ramosi.
See ya.
And the most unreliable of us all, and Christopher Morgan.
Look, just because my opinions, you don't agree with them, doesn't make them unreliable.
Good night.
We'll see you next time.
This has been the Neophytes of Narratology. We hope that you've experienced an epiphany or two of the literary nature, but only metaphorically, of course.
Editing and engineering by Jonathan Ian Manser. Music by Christopher Morgan. Check us out on YouTube and iTunes for the shows, and on Facebook and Twitter for updates.